I'm Vamsi Juluri. I'm a professor of media studies at USF. And I was struck by this article in CNN today, which says that racists are now openly targeting Indian Americans by Harmeet Kaur. And naturally, this article has got a lot of responses on Twitter. People are saying, finally, somebody recognizes these attacks that are taking place on us from a section of the MAGA right wing. And I wanted to go through a close reading of CNN's coverage or exclusionary coverage, rather, over here, and talk about a few omissions, as these insights I think would be helpful for anybody who is concerned about these issues and also concerned about the fact that the media, especially media like CNN, which profess to be on the liberal or anti racist side, how they frequently skew the coverage in a way that prevents us from understanding an issue completely and honestly. So rather than take this article at its face value, I wanted to point out that perhaps this article really should have been called this: Racists are still making excuses for other racists by whitewashing Hindu phobia against Indian Americans. So, let me explain quickly what I mean by that. So, here is the report. Uh, excuse me. And powerful graphic which shows that angry people, angry fists, and get out fingers pointing at this gentleman with a frayed Indian flag. And they start with this example of attack on Kash Patel on X during Diwali. And it's very interesting. So the example they start with is about how somebody said, "Go back home and worship your sand demons." And this was a far right pastor. and then they go on to talk about all the attacks on Vivek Ramaswamy and others. And so yeah, so these are examples we're all familiar with now. These have been happening since, in a very big way, on online since December. Now, the interesting thing, though, is the way they have kind of, set up the discourse, supposedly anti-racist discourse, on this issue, which they admit is racism. And they quote, a couple of reports here, which from people who have supposedly been studying this hate. So if you go into these links, here is the first one. It's from a report called Anti-Indian Hate on X by the Center for Study of Organized Hate. And it's supposedly a non-partisan think tank. And if you go to page 6, it's made very clear by the authors of this report that these attacks are not Hindu-phobic. Okay? And I mean, look at the lack of honesty and integrity here. They say that if you describe these attacks, and remember the first example the CNN report started with was the slur, sand demon worshipper. So this idea of this phrase of a demon worshipper is a specifically anti-pagan, anti-Hindu slur used by intolerant monotheists, and yet they want to somehow whitewash this phrase, whitewash this phenomena, and deny that this has anything to do with Hindu phobia. Instead, they go into this platitude that Hindu phobia is a Hindu nationalist belief, and people who say Hindu phobic believe that all Indians are Hindu, and far right Hindus, whatever that means. So, you can look at how cynical this is really, that CNN and this supposed study Center for Studying Anti-Indian Hate and the people quoted here like Hindus for Human Rights, all of them are existing, it appears, to not actually fight racism in a constructive way. After all, they could be fighting Hindu phobia and Islamophobia, in a honest and constructive way. But instead, they're putting up, this farce of an opposition against MAGA anti-Indian racism to just kind of dig in their heels and continue to claim that Hindu phobia doesn't exist. Anyway, these are some of the other links in the CNN report. The Jeet and Pajit slurs. This is from the Stop Appy Hate report or article linked here. And here too, you don't see any discussion of the historic context of some of these slurs in anti-Hindu, anti-pagan, anti-kafir stereotypes and hatreds. This is another article on the Stop Appy Hate thing. And again, it looks like, the timing of this whole CNN report is really to kind of offer a sop for Mr. Mamdani here, who's obviously faced racist tropes himself in his campaign, for eating with his hands and things like that. But somehow, a fairly privileged South Asian diaspora politician who's just won a huge election and who's not lacking for protection and privilege, being projected as the main victim of this, anti-Indian hate, which is very, very deeply anti-Hindu hate, is appalling. And anyway, so I wanted to point out there is, of course, another study which many of us are familiar with, which CNN will pretend doesn't exist. This is a study done by the NCRI. I think there's at least 2 or 3 studies that they've done so far. The National Contagion Research Institute, Prasiddha Sudhakar and others. And, they're studying this extensively online and also pointing out that many of these tropes are anti-Hindu, anti-Semitic, and they're coming both from the far right whites as well as the far right brown / jihadists, and horrible stuff that's been going on online. And yet all CNN has to say here is, it's because somehow Indians are not allying with other oppressed communities and, people like Mamdani and others. So I wanted to also give a little bit of historic context for people who are still, discovering some of these issues for the first time. So if you go back to early 2017, this is my article in Huffington Post about a very horrible and provocative and irresponsible show CNN put out. It was called Believer. It featured Reza Aslan, a very popular author, who used to write a lot about Islamophobia. So Reza Aslan's, little colonial adventure romp to Kashi. By the way, CNN called Kashi the city of death, not the city of light. And it was a very, very skewed and dishonest program, and it was called Believer. And I wrote about it, and this was very widely quoted. And the problem with this CNN program back then was not only that it was a very colonial and condescending show where Aslan goes to Kashi, meets some Aghoras, and then talks about how cannibalism is the only way out of the Hindu caste system. Excuse me. But what was deeply disappointing back then was, that there was a very, very frightening real life context. There were attacks taking place in real life, and particularly on a young man named Srinivas Kuchibotla, who was, I honored his memory that day. And after Oscar night, nobody even mentioned his name at the Oscars that year. He was a young man, in a bar, and somebody came and shot him dead in Kansas City. Anyway, so that was the reason I think many Indian Americans were very concerned about CNN's program, and many people went to the CNN office and protested, outside the office. And this was CNN's response. Varun Soni, I think he was a first Hindu chaplain or Hindu American chaplain, and he wrote this piece published by CNN called "Why I'm Haunted by My Religion's Dark Side." Again, you can see how cynical it is, and Hindus are smeared and dehumanized and marked for attacks. You have the so-called anti-racist voices, some academics and CNN, coming along and, platforming very, very skewed and dishonest pieces like this. Here, Varun Suri talks about how he went to India and he saw the dark side of Hinduism. And the examples, are again, about poverty and discrimination and things like that. And the big picture again, one needs to remember is, of course, all of these are terrible things, but why is it that whenever these so-called progressive spiritual tourists go to India, when they see poverty, somehow the cause does not become colonialism or the corruption of the neoliberal state or the greed of capitalism, which are usually the causes for many of these social problems like inequality and environmental degradation in every land on earth. But somehow it is the ancient traditions of Hinduism that become the problem. And I wanted to end with a slightly wider context. Recently, in my media history class, we were discussing this amazing movie called Mr. Jones, about a young reporter, journalist who goes to Ukraine in the 1930s. And he realizes there's a massive famine taking place there, which Stalin's government is covering up, and the New York Times foreign correspondent is complicit in covering this up. So we were talking about the role of foreign correspondents, I think whether it's CNN or New York Times, in covering up reality like this. And then we also talked a little bit about Churchill's role in the Bengal famine. And it became very clear to me that from then to now, the problem really is encapsulated in just this one image, that whether it's academia or South Asia studies, people or these so-called anti-racist researchers, this is what they're doing. They will come and talk about racism, they'll talk about poverty, hunger, discrimination, and much like how those people gave cover to Stalin, whose policies were causing the famines. What they do is provide scapegoats. And Hinduism, and specifically this trope of the greedy Brahmin, has been scapegoat number one for such a long time now. So again, when CNN says racists are openly targeting Indian Americans, don't forget the racists who have been enabling these people, including the apologists and dishonest people quoted here.